It was a quiet evening in a small town called Oak Ridge. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. A young boy sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV while his mom bustled around in the kitchen. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly big and round as she prepared dinner for the two of them. Life wasn't always easy for this family, but they had each other, and that was enough. The boy, let's call him the kid, was only 12 years old, but he carried himself like someone much older. He'd learned early on how to take care of things when life got tough. His dad wasn't around anymore, so it was just him and his mom holding down the fort. They didn't have much, but their bond made up for what they lacked in material stuff. That night, though, everything changed. His mom stood by the counter chopping vegetables. She suddenly froze. Her hand went to her stomach, and then, without warning, she collapsed onto the tiled floor. The knife clattered beside her, and the sound echoed through the house. The kid heard it from the living room and bolted upright. "Mom," he called, out, his voice tinged with worry. When there was no answer, he ran into the kitchen. His heart sank at the sight before him. His mom lay sprawled on the floor, clutching her stomach and gasping for breath. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew he had to act fast. Grabbing the phone off the counter, he dialed 911 with trembling fingers. On the other end of the line, a woman answered. Her voice sounded bored, almost annoyed, as if she'd already written off the call before hearing a single word. "911, what's your emergency?" she said flatly. The kid tried to explain the situation as clearly as he could. "Please, you have to help me. My mom fell down and she can't breathe. She's pregnant and I don't know what to do." His words tumbled out in a rush, panic creeping into his tone despite his best efforts to stay composed. But instead of jumping into action, the operator hesitated. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Then came the response that would haunt the kid for days to come. "Are you sure this isn't some kind of prank? You're wasting valuable resources," the operator snapped. Before the kid could respond, the line went dead. For a moment, the kid just stared at the phone in disbelief. Had that really happened? Wasn't 911 supposed to help people in emergencies? Shaking off the shock, he redialed the number, hoping maybe someone else would pick up. But it was the same operator again. This time, she didn't even let him finish, explaining. "I told you, stop calling here with fake stories," she barked before hanging up once more. Fear gripped the kid's chest like a vice. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't just sit there and watch his mom struggle. She needed help, and every second counted. With tears streaming down his face, he knelt beside her and did the only thing he could think of. He tried to keep her comfortable. Using bits and pieces of information he'd picked up from watching medical shows on TV, he propped her legs up with pillows and talked to her softly, telling her over and over again that everything would be okay. But deep down, he wasn't sure if it would be. Time felt like it was slipping away, each passing minute stretching longer than the last. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. At just 12 years old, he shouldn't have been dealing with something like this. Yet here he was, trying desperately to save the person who meant the most to him in the world. He glanced toward the door, wondering if anyone nearby might hear him if he screamed for help. But the neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel completely alone. Still, he refused to give up. If the operator wouldn't listen, maybe someone else would. With one last look at his mom, the kid made a decision. He grabbed the phone, slipped on his sneakers, and stepped outside into the cool night air. Determination burned in his chest as he ran toward the nearest house, praying someone would open their door and believe him. Little did he know, this act of bravery would set off a chain reaction that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others, too. The cool night air hit the kid's face as he stepped outside, his heart pounding like a drum. He clutched the phone tightly in one hand, its screen still glowing faintly from the last unanswered call to 911. His sneakers slapped against the pavement as he ran barefoot toward the nearest house. his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say and whether anyone would believe him. He reached the first house, a small white cottage with flower boxes under the windows. The porch light was on, but no one answered when he knocked frantically on the door. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Please, someone help me." But there was only silence. Frustrated and scared, he moved on to the next house. The second house looked dark, its curtains drawn tight. The kid hesitated for a moment before knocking anyway, hoping someone might be inside. Again, no response. His chest tightened as panic began to creep back in. What if no one came to help? What if it was already too late? Finally, he reached a third house, a cozy brick home with warm yellow light spilling out onto the driveway. An elderly woman opened the door almost immediately, her kind eyes widening in concern when she saw the boy standing there. His face was streaked with tears and his breaths came in short, ragged gasps. "Ma'am, please," the kid blurted out, barely able to get the words out. "My mom, she's really sick. She fell down and I called 911, but they won't send anyone. Please, can you help me?" The woman, let's call her the neighbor, didn't hesitate. She stepped aside, letting the boy into her home. "Of course, sweetheart, tell me everything," she said gently, leading him to the couch. Her voice was calm and reassuring, the kind that made you feel like things might actually turn out okay. Through sobs, the kid explained what had happened: the fall, the desperate calls to 911, the operator who refused to listen. The neighbor's expression turned serious as she listened intently, her jaw tightening with anger. Without wasting another second, she picked up her own phone and dialed 911. "This is an emergency," she said firmly when the operator answered. "A woman has collapsed at her home and she's 8 months pregnant. You need to send paramedics, immediately." When the operator tried to argue, claiming they'd already received multiple fake calls about this situation, the neighbor cut her off. "Listen to me," she snapped, her voice sharp as steel. "I'm calling from across the street. This is real. Send help now." It took some convincing, but eventually the neighbor managed to get through to them. Paramedics were dispatched, though precious time had already been lost. As soon as the call ended, she turned to the boy. "They're coming," she assured him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did good by coming here. Stay strong." Back at the house, the minutes felt like hours. The kid paced nervously, glancing out the window every few seconds for any sign of flashing lights or sirens. His mom lay where he'd left her, her breathing shallow and uneven. He knelt beside her again, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. "Just hang on, Mom. Help is coming. Please don't leave me." When the ambulance finally arrived, relief washed over him like a tidal wave. The paramedics rushed inside, their movements quick and efficient. They assessed his mom's condition and loaded her onto a stretcher, working tirelessly to stabilize her. One of them stayed behind to comfort the boy, explaining that they were taking her to the hospital and that he could ride along if he wanted to. At the hospital, chaos erupted. Doctors and nurses swarmed around his mom, shouting orders and hooking her up to machines. The boy sat alone in a waiting room, clutching a paper cup of water that someone had handed him. He stared blankly at the floor, replaying the events of the night over and over in his head. Why hadn't the operator believed him? Why had it taken so long for help to arrive? Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged from the emergency room. The boy jumped to his feet, his heart hammering in anticipation. "How is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor gave him a small, tired smile. "She's stable for now. We performed an emergency procedure to deliver the baby. Both your mom and the newborn are critical, but alive. They're fighters." Tears filled the boy's eyes, this time not from fear, but from gratitude. Against all odds, they had made it through. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to breathe. But while the immediate danger had passed, the ordeal was far from over. News of the incident spread quickly, thanks to the neighbor, who couldn't stay silent about what had happened. Recordings of the boy's initial 911 calls surfaced, revealing the operator's dismissive attitude and blatant disregard for his pleas. People were outraged, and soon the story became national news. For the boy, however, the focus remained on his family. Every day he visited his mom and the tiny newborn in the hospital, sitting by their bedsides and talking to them as if they could hear him. He told them stories about school, about their favorite TV shows, about anything that might bring a little light into their recovery. Slowly but surely, they began to improve. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, the world was buzzing with questions and demands for justice. How could something like this happen? How could a child's cry for help be ignored because of prejudice? These were uncomfortable truths that society wasn't ready to confront, but the boy's courage forced everyone to pay attention. Though he didn't realize it yet, his actions that night had sparked something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about saving his mom anymore. It was about shining a light on a system that desperately needed change. And as he held his mom's hand in the hospital room, unaware of the storm brewing beyond those doors, he proved that even in the darkest moments, hope can shine through, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. The days following the incident felt like a blur for the boy. Between visiting his mom and the newborn in the hospital, dealing with reporters knocking on their door, and trying to process everything that had happened, he barely had time to catch his breath. But even in the chaos, one thing was clear. The story wasn't going away anytime soon. News outlets couldn't get enough of it. The recordings of the 911 calls played on repeat during news segments, each replay adding fuel to the growing outrage. People were shocked by the operator's dismissive tone and refusal to take the boy seriously. Social media exploded with posts calling for accountability, using hashtags like "Listen to the kids" and "Justice for families." Protesters gathered outside the local police department, holding signs that read, "Emergency calls shouldn't be ignored," and "Bias has no place in 911." At first, the boy didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening. He was just a kid who wanted his mom to get better. But as the story gained traction, strangers started reaching out, offering support, sharing their own experiences, and praising him for his bravery. Some sent letters or gifts to the hospital. Others stopped him on the street to thank him for speaking up. It was overwhelming, but also comforting in a strange way. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in this fight. One day, while sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of hot chocolate, the boy met someone who would change everything. She introduced herself as a community activist, a woman in her mid-30s with a warm smile and a notebook always in hand. Her name wasn't important, but her passion was undeniable. She sat down across from him and asked if she could talk to him about what had happened. "I know this has been hard for you," she said gently, "but your story is powerful. It's shining a light on something we've been trying to fix for years. People are listening now because of you." The boy looked at her, unsure of what to say. He hadn't thought of himself as brave or heroic. He was just doing what anyone would do for their family. But the activist explained how his experience could be a catalyst for change. Together, they brainstormed ideas for making sure no one else had to go through what he did. That's when the petition idea came up. The activist suggested starting an online campaign demanding better training for 911 operators, especially when it came to handling calls from marginalized communities. "It's not just about punishing the person who ignored you," she explained. "It's about making sure this never happens again, to anyone." With her guidance, the boy helped draft the petition. They titled it, "No More Ignored Calls," and launched it on a popular platform. Within hours, signatures poured in from all over the country. By the end of the week, it had reached hundreds of thousands. People shared personal stories in the comment section about being dismissed by authorities, about feeling invisible because of their race or background. The boy read every comment, amazed by how many people connected with his struggle. Schools began inviting him to speak at assemblies. At first, he was nervous. Standing in front of a room full of kids felt intimidating, especially since he still saw himself as just a regular 12-year-old. But once he started talking, something shifted. He told his story honestly, without sugarcoating the fear or frustration he'd felt that night. And the students listened, not because they were told to, but because they could see themselves in him. After one particularly moving speech, a teacher approached him with tears in her eyes. You're teaching these kids something we can't teach them in a textbook, she said. You're showing them what courage looks like. As the weeks went by, the movement grew bigger than anyone could have imagined. Local leaders organized town hall meetings to discuss emergency response reform. The boy attended some of these events, sitting alongside his mom, who was finally well enough to join him, and speaking directly to officials. His voice carried weight, not because he shouted or demanded attention, but because he spoke from the heart. One meeting stood out, more than the others. A group of parents shared their concerns about how emergencies involving children were handled. One mother recounted how her son's asthma attack had been brushed off by a dispatcher until it was almost too late. Another talked about how language barriers had delayed help for her elderly father. Each story added another layer to the conversation, proving that this wasn't just about one boy or one family. It was about a broken system that needed fixing. Through it all, the boy remained grounded. He knew he couldn't solve every problem overnight, but he also knew he had started something important. Every signature on the petition, every supportive message, every person who showed up to a rally reminded him that he wasn't fighting alone. Back at the hospital, his mom watched him with pride. She'd always known her son was special, but seeing him step into this role of leadership filled her with awe. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," she told him one evening as they sat together in her room. The baby slept peacefully. In a bassinet nearby, tiny fingers curled around his blanket. "I'm just doing what feels right," the boy replied, shrugging modestly. But deep down, he knew he was part of something bigger than himself. What had started as a desperate attempt to save his mom had turned into a mission to protect families everywhere. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he was ready to keep going. Because sometimes, even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. And for the boy, that realization was worth more than any headline or hashtag. The momentum of the movement continued to build, and it wasn't long before the boy found himself at the center of a national conversation. News outlets clamored for interviews, community leaders sought his input, and even politicians began citing his story as a reason for urgent reform. But despite all the attention, the boy stayed grounded. He didn't see himself as a hero or a celebrity, just someone who wanted to make sure no one else had to feel the way he did that night. One day, an invitation arrived in the mail, or, rather, an email, since they didn't have a physical mailbox anymore thanks to reporters camping outside their home. It was from a city council meeting happening downtown. The subject line read, "We need your voice." At first, the boy hesitated. Public speaking still made him nervous, especially when he thought about facing adults in suits who might not take him seriously. But the activist who'd helped him start the petition encouraged him. "You've already inspired so many people," she said. "This is your chance to tell decision-makers exactly what needs to change." With a deep breath, the boy agreed. On the morning of the meeting, his mom walked him to the car, her arm around his shoulders. "You've got this," she said with a reassuring smile. "Just speak from your heart. That's all anyone can ask for." When they arrived at the city hall, the scene was overwhelming. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted out like a forest of metal, and a sea of faces turned toward him as he stepped inside. Some were curious, others skeptical, but most seemed genuinely eager to hear what he had to say. The room buzzed with anticipation as he took his seat at the front table beside other speakers, a mix of activists, experts, and officials. His turn came sooner than he expected. As he stood up and approached the podium, the room fell silent. For a moment, he froze, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden stand. Then he glanced at the crowd and saw familiar faces. The activist who'd supported him, his mom sitting proudly in the back row, and even a few classmates who'd come to show their support. Taking a shaky breath, he began, "I'm here today because something happened to me that shouldn't happen to anyone." He started, his voice soft but steady. "My mom collapsed one night and I called 911. I told them what was wrong, but the operator didn't believe me. She hung up on me. Not once, but twice. And because of that, my mom almost died." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room remained silent, every eye fixed on him. I know now that what happened wasn't just about me or my family. It's part of a bigger problem. People are treated differently based on how they sound, how they look, or where they live. When you call for help, you shouldn't have to prove you deserve it. Help should come automatically. That's what 911 is supposed to mean. As he spoke, his confidence grew. He talked about the nights he spent worrying whether his mom would pull through, about the frustration of being ignored, and about the hope he felt when strangers rallied around him. He shared stories from the comment section of the petition, about parents whose kids were turned away during emergencies, about elderly neighbors who couldn't get help because of language barriers, about families torn apart by negligence. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, the Mia. Even some of the council members wiped tears from their cheeks. When he stepped back to his seat, the applause was thunderous. His mom beamed at him from across the room, giving him 2 thumbs up. For the first time in weeks, the boy allowed himself to feel proud. But the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at overhauling the emergency response system. Mandatory anti-bias training for dispatchers became a key focus, along with stricter accountability measures for those who mishandled calls. The petition, which now had millions of signatures, served as undeniable proof that the public demanded change. Not everyone was happy about it, though. Critics argued that the reforms would cost too much money or slow down response times. Some accused the boy of exaggerating his story for attention, but he didn't let the negativity get to him. Instead, he leaned on the support of his growing network, friends, neighbors, teachers, and even strangers who sent messages of encouragement. One particularly touching moment came when a woman approached him after a community event. She was older, with silver hair and kind eyes. "I lost my son years ago because no one believed me when I called for help," she said, her voice trembling. "What you're doing, it gives me hope that things can be different for others." Her words stuck with him long after she left. They reminded him why this fight mattered, not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever been dismissed or ignored. Meanwhile, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be. His mom was discharged from the hospital, though she still needed regular checkups. The baby, now a few weeks old, was thriving, filling the house with coos and giggles. The boy went back to school, where his classmates treated him like a local celebrity. Teachers praised him for using his experience to create positive change, and friends joked about someday writing books about him. Despite all the progress, the boy knew the battle wasn't over. Change took time, and there would always be obstacles along the way. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. Every person who signed the petition, attended a rally, or simply shared his story online was standing with him. Together, they were building something bigger than any one individual, a future where everyone, regardless of who they were, could count on being heard in their moment of need. And as he tucked his little sibling into bed one evening, watching the baby drift off to sleep with a contented sigh, he felt a quiet sense of peace. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew he'd done everything he could to protect his family, and maybe, just maybe, helped protect others too. The movement sparked by the boy's courage didn't just stop at petitions and speeches. It grew into something tangible, something people could feel in their everyday lives. The changes were slow at first, almost imperceptible, but over time, they began to take shape. New policies rolled out across emergency response departments nationwide, mandating anti-bias training for all operators. Cities started implementing systems to track and review every 911 call, ensuring accountability for those who mishandled emergencies. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a step toward making sure no one would ever be ignored again. For the boy, life became a balancing act between being a regular kid and an accidental advocate. Mornings were spent getting ready for school, helping his mom with the baby, and trying to keep up with homework. Afternoons, however, often turned into meetings with community leaders, interviews with journalists, or brainstorming sessions with the activist who had become like a mentor to him. Despite the whirlwind of activity, he never lost sight of what mattered most: his family. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with his mom, he reflected on how far they'd come. Do you think things will really change? He asked her, kicking his feet back and forth as he leaned against the railing. His mom looked at him thoughtfully, her gaze soft but steady. I think they already are, she replied. You've shown people that it's possible to stand up, even when it feels impossible. That's powerful. Her words stayed with him, long after the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He realized that while he couldn't fix everything overnight, he had planted seeds of hope, and those seeds were beginning to sprout. But not everyone was on board with the changes. Some critics argued that the new measures were unnecessary, claiming that incidents like the one involving the boy were rare exceptions rather than systemic problems. Others worried about the costs associated with implementing reforms, suggesting that resources should go elsewhere. These voices occasionally made headlines, sparking debates online and in town halls. The boy read these arguments feeling a mix of frustration and determination. He understood that change rarely came without pushback, but that didn't mean he had to stay silent. During one particularly heated discussion on a local news program, he was invited to share his perspective. Sitting under bright studio lights, he listened patiently as a panelist questioned whether the reforms were worth the effort. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and leaned forward. I get it. Change can seem hard, he said. But imagine if it was your mom lying there needing help and no one listened. Imagine if it was your little brother or sister calling 911 scared and alone. Would you still say it's not worth it? The room fell silent. Even the skeptic seemed to pause, considering his words. By putting a human face to the issue, he reminded everyone why the fight mattered, not because of statistics or policies, but because real lives were at stake. As the weeks went by, more stories emerged of families benefiting from the reforms. A young girl whose diabetic father collapsed during the night credited the quick response of newly trained operators with saving his life. An elderly woman recounted how language translation services implemented in emergency dispatch centers helped paramedics arrive just in time to treat her stroke. Each story added fuel to the fire, proving that the work was paying off. The boy also found solace in smaller victories, the kind that didn't make headlines, but meant the world to him. One day, after giving a talk at a nearby school, a shy, fifth grader approached him. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. My grandma called 911 last week because she fell, the girl said softly. They sent help right away. I just wanted to say thank you. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes as he knelt down to meet her gaze. You don't have to thank me, he said gently. Just promise me you'll keep believing that your voice matters. She nodded, smiling before running off to join her friends. Watching her go, the boy felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why he kept going. Not for fame or recognition, but for moments like this where he could see the impact of his efforts rippling outward. Back home, his mom continued to recover, growing stronger with each passing day. The baby thrived, too, learning to smile and giggle in response to silly faces and tickles. Life wasn't always easy. There were still bills to pay, appointments to keep, and challenges to navigate. But there was joy, too. Joy in knowing that they had overcome something unimaginable together. One evening, as the three of them sat around the kitchen table eating dinner, the boy glanced at his mom and grinned. Remember when we thought everything was falling apart? He teased. His mom laughed, shaking her head. And look at us now, she said, gesturing to the cozy scene before them. We're unstoppable. That night, as he tucked the baby into bed and kissed his mom goodnight, the boy allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, and there would still be battles to fight. But he also knew that he had built something extraordinary, a network of support, a platform for change, and a legacy of resilience. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving that terrifying night. It was about thriving afterward. It was about turning pain into purpose, fear into action, and doubt into determination. And as he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the love of his family, the boy felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the countless strangers who had stood beside him along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to make a difference. But tonight, under the glow of the moonlight streaming through his window, he let himself dream of a future where everyone, no matter who they were, could count on being heard. The ripple effects of the boy's bravery continued to spread far beyond his small town. What had started as a desperate plea for help on a quiet evening had transformed into a nationwide movement, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. But while the world celebrated the progress being made, the boy himself remained grounded. For him, it wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever feel as powerless as he did that night. One day, an unexpected letter arrived at their doorstep. It was handwritten, not typed, and carried a warmth that emails and social media messages simply couldn't replicate. The envelope bore a return address from another state, a place the boy had never been to, but the words inside spoke directly to his heart. "Dear brave one," it began. "I don't know if you'll remember me, but we met briefly during one of your talks. I'm the woman who lost my son because no one believed me when I called for help. That day you reminded me that hope still exists in this world. Because of you, I found the strength to share my story with others. Thank you for giving me back a piece of myself." The boy read the letter over and over, each word sinking deeper into his soul. He hadn't realized how much his actions meant to people like her, people who had carried their pain silently for years, afraid to speak up. Reading those lines made him understand something profound. Healing wasn't just for those who were hurt. It was also for those who listened. Inspired by the letter, the boy decided to create a space where people could share their stories without fear of judgment. With the help of the activist who had guided him since the beginning, he launched a community initiative called Voices Unheard. It was a platform, both online and offline, for individuals to talk about their experiences with emergency services, discrimination, or any situation where they felt ignored. The goal was simple: to amplify voices that had long been silenced. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life poured in their stories, some heart-wrenching, others hopeful, but all incredibly powerful. A single mother recounted how paramedics dismissed her concerns about her child's high fever, only to discover later that the child had a severe infection. A college student described calling 911 after witnessing a car accident, only to be brushed off until bystanders intervened. Each story added another layer to the conversation, proving that the issue was bigger than anyone had initially thought. But it wasn't just about sharing pain, it was about finding solutions together. At the first Voices Unheard event, held in a local community center, dozens of attendees gathered to listen, learn, and brainstorm ideas. Emergency responders, activists, teachers, parents, and even kids participated, creating a melting pot of perspectives. The boy stood at the front of the room, nervous but excited as he introduced the gathering. "We're here today because we believe in change," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. But when we come together, when we listen to each other, amazing things can happen." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the next few hours, the room buzzed with energy. Participants broke into smaller groups to discuss specific issues, such as improving training for dispatchers, addressing language barriers, and building trust between communities and emergency services. By the end of the day, everyone left with actionable steps they could take to make a difference in their own neighborhoods. Word of the event quickly spread, inspiring similar gatherings in cities across the country. What had started as a small idea in the boy's mind blossomed into a national network of support and advocacy. Local leaders reached out, asking how they could replicate the model in their areas. Schools incorporated discussions about empathy and accountability into their curriculums. Even some emergency response departments invited the boy to speak at staff meetings, eager to learn from his perspective. Through it all, the boy stayed humble. He knew he wasn't the expert. He was just someone who cared deeply about fairness and justice. And yet, his authenticity resonated with people in a way that polished speeches or formal presentations never could. Whether he was speaking to a room full of adults or chatting with classmates during lunch, his message remained the same. Every voice matters. Back at home, life continued to improve. His mom returned to work part-time, juggling shifts at a local cafe while caring for the baby. The newborn, now several months old, grew into a curious and playful toddler, filling the house with laughter and mischief. Watching them interact, the boy often felt a surge of gratitude. They had faced so much uncertainty, but somehow, they had emerged stronger than ever. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything caught up with him. Late at night, lying in bed, he sometimes replayed the events of that fateful evening in his mind. What if the neighbor hadn't answered the door? What if the ambulance had arrived too late? These questions haunted him, but they also fueled his determination to keep pushing forward. If he could prevent even one family from experiencing the same terror, then every sleepless night would be worth it. During one particularly tough week, when criticism from opponents of the reforms threatened to derail progress, the boy received another reminder of why he kept going. A package arrived containing a handmade quilt, stitched with colorful patches depicting symbols of unity and resilience. Attached was a note. From a group of grandmothers who believe in you, keep shining your light. Holding the quilt in his arms, the boy felt tears prick his eyes. It wasn't just fabric, it was a symbol of solidarity, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. That night he wrapped himself in the quilt and sat by the window, staring at the stars. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to truly rest, letting the kindness of strangers wash over him like a warm embrace. As the months passed, the boy began to see glimpses of the future he had dreamed of. Emergency response times improved in marginalized communities. Dispatchers underwent rigorous anti-bias training, learning to approach every call with empathy and professionalism. Families who once feared reaching out for help now felt confident knowing their voices would be heard, and through it all, the boy remained a beacon of hope, not because he was perfect, but because he was human. He laughed, cried, stumbled, and rose again, showing everyone around him that courage isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about moving forward anyway. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the wind, the boy stood outside his school, watching younger students play tag in the yard. A little girl ran up to him, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Are you the kid who helped fix 911?" she asked wide-eyed. He chuckled, kneeling down to her level. "I didn't do it alone," he replied. "Lots of people work together to make things better." Her face lit up with admiration. "Well, I think you're awesome," she declared, before dashing off to join her friends. Watching her go, the boy smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was what it was all about, not fame or glory, but inspiring others to believe in the power of their own voices. As he walked toward the school doors, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over, but together, they were building a brighter tomorrow. As the months rolled on, the boy began to notice subtle changes in the world around him. It wasn't just big headlines or policy updates that caught his attention. It was the small, everyday moments that showed how far they'd come. One afternoon, while walking home from school, he overheard a group of kids talking about their latest class project. They were designing posters to raise awareness about fairness in emergency services, inspired by stories they'd learned about in class. The boy stopped for a moment, listening as one of them proudly declared, "If someone calls for help, you've got to listen, no matter what." Hearing those words made him smile. He didn't need to be standing in front of cameras or giving speeches anymore to know that his message was reaching people. Change was happening quietly, but steadily, seeping into classrooms, dinner tables, and community meetings. And it wasn't just adults who were paying attention. Kids were starting to see themselves as part of the solution too. But not everything was smooth sailing. There were still days when frustration bubbled to the surface, especially when old habits died hard. Some dispatchers resisted the new training programs, grumbling that they didn't have time for fluff courses. Others argued that mistakes were rare and shouldn't overshadow all the good work emergency responders did every day. These voices weren't loud enough to derail progress. But they were persistent, reminding everyone that change required constant effort. The boy faced these challenges head-on, refusing to let setbacks discourage him. During one particularly heated town hall meeting, a man stood up and accused the reforms of being unnecessary. "We're wasting money on this nonsense," he said, his voice rising above the murmurs in the room. "Most operators do their jobs just fine." The boy listened carefully, letting the man finish before stepping up to the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "I agree that most operators are doing great work," he said. "But even one mistake is too many when someone's life is on the line. Training isn't about pointing fingers. It's about making sure everyone gets the help they deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, and the man sat down, looking thoughtful. Once again, the boy had managed to turn anger into understanding, reminding everyone why they were fighting for change in the first place. Despite the occasional pushback, there were plenty of victories to celebrate. In cities where the new policies had been fully implemented, response times improved significantly, especially in underserved neighborhoods. Families shared heartwarming stories of operators going above and beyond to ensure their safety. One mother recounted how an operator stayed on the line with her during a medical emergency, guiding her through CPR until paramedics arrived. Another family praised the dispatcher who recognized signs of domestic violence during a routine call and sent police to intervene. These success stories gave the boy hope, fueling his determination to keep pushing forward. But perhaps the most meaningful victories were the ones that happened behind the scenes, the friendships forged, the trust rebuilt, and the sense of unity that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard, the boy sat with his mom and little sibling, enjoying a rare, quiet moment. The baby babbled happily, waving chubby arms in the air, while his mom sipped tea and watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange. For a while, no one spoke. They simply soaked in the peace of being together. Finally, his mom broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "when all this started, I was so scared. Not just for me, but for you. I didn't want you to carry this weight alone." The boy looked at her, surprised. "I'm not alone," he replied. "Not anymore. People care about what happened to us, and they're working hard to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." His mom nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's true, but don't forget, you're allowed to take breaks too. You're still just a kid after all." Her words struck a chord deep within him. She was right. He couldn't pour endlessly from an empty cup. Lately, he'd been feeling stretched thin, juggling schoolwork, activism, and family responsibilities. Maybe it was time to slow down, even if just for a little while. The next morning, he woke up with a fresh perspective. Instead of diving straight into emails and planning sessions, he decided to spend the day focusing on himself and his loved ones. He played games with the baby, helped his mom bake cookies, and even spent some time sketching pictures in his notebook, a hobby he hadn't touched in months. By the end of the day, he felt lighter, recharged, and ready to tackle whatever came next. This new balance became a cornerstone of his life. He learned to prioritize self-care without losing sight of his mission. Whether it was taking long walks, journaling his thoughts, or simply laughing with friends, he discovered that rest was just as important as action, and the more grounded he felt, the clearer his vision for the future became. In the weeks that followed, the boy took on a new challenge, mentoring other young advocates. He met kids from all over the country who wanted to make a difference, but didn't know where to start. Together, they brainstormed ideas, shared resources, and supported one another through the ups and downs of activism. Seeing their passion reignited his own, reminding him that the fight for justice was never truly solitary. One of these mentees, a shy girl from a neighboring town, stood out to him. She had written a letter thanking him for inspiring her to speak up about bullying at her school. "Before I heard your story, I thought my voice didn't matter," she wrote. "Now I know it does." When they finally met in person, the boy hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with pride. "You're the reason we're doing this," he told her. to show people like you that your voice can change the world." By the end of the year, the movement had grown beyond anything the boy could have imagined. Cities adopted new protocols, schools integrated empathy training into their curriculums, and communities rallied around causes that once seemed impossible to address. Yet amidst all the progress, the boy remained humble. He knew the work wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but he also knew they were moving in the right direction. One chilly December evening, as snowflakes danced in the air, the boy stood outside his house watching the neighborhood light up with holiday decorations. His mom joined him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. He smiled, gazing at the twinkling lights. "I'm thinking about how far we've come, and how much farther we can go. We're not done yet, but I think we're getting closer to something really special." His mom squeezed his hand. "You'll get there," she said firmly, "and you won't be alone." For the first time in a long time, the boy felt at peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but he was ready. With love, resilience, and a community of supporters by his side, he knew anything was possible. As the snow settled softly on the ground, he whispered a silent promise to himself and to the world. The fight for fairness wasn't over. It was just beginning. Months turned into a year, and the boy found himself standing on a stage once again. But this time it was different. The event wasn't just about him. It was a celebration of everyone who had contributed to the movement. Families, activists, emergency responders, teachers, and even strangers from across the country had gathered in a large auditorium to honor those who refused to stay silent when it mattered most. The room buzzed with energy, filled with laughter, hugs, and the occasional tear. The boy stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before him. There were people he recognized. His mom, sitting proudly in the front row with the baby now toddling around her feet, and countless others he didn't know but whose stories he'd come to cherish. Each person represented a piece of the puzzle they had all been working on together. A world where no one would be ignored or dismissed in their moment of need. He took a deep breath, glancing down at the note cards in his hands. Then, realizing he didn't need them, he set them aside and spoke from the heart. "A year ago, I thought my job was done after saving my mom," he began, his voice steady yet warm. "But what I've learned since then is that helping someone doesn't end when the crisis does. It's about making sure other families don't have to face the same fear we did." His words resonated deeply with the crowd. People nodded, some wiping away tears as they remembered their own struggles and triumphs over the past year. He went on to share highlights of the journey, the petitions, the protests, the late-night meetings, and the small victories that added up to something extraordinary. But more than anything, he talked about hope. "Hope isn't something you wait for," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's something you create, and I've seen so many of you creating hope, not just for yourselves, but for others, too. That's why we're here today. Because together we've shown that change is possible." When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering not just for him but for the collective effort that had brought them this far. The boy stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by gratitude. As he returned to his seat, his mom pulled him into a tight hug, whispering, "You've done good, sweetheart." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, the boy wandered outside to clear his head. The cool night air felt refreshing against his skin, and the stars above seemed brighter than usual. He leaned against a railing, watching as groups of attendees lingered nearby, sharing stories and laughter. A woman approached him holding a plate of leftover cake. "You deserve this," she said with a smile, handing it to him. "Thank you for everything." He accepted the cake graciously, touched by her kindness. "I couldn't have done any of this without people like you," he replied honestly. She nodded, patting his shoulder before walking away. As he stood there savoring the sweetness of the dessert, he reflected on how much had changed, not just in the world but within himself. A year ago, he was just a kid trying to save his mom. Now he was part of something bigger than he could have ever dreamed. Yet despite the accolades and recognition, he knew the real reward lay in the connections he'd made along the way. The next morning, life returned to its usual rhythm. School resumed. The baby woke up early demanding breakfast, and his mom juggled household chores while preparing for another day at work. But there was a new sense of purpose in their routine, a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had faced adversity and emerged stronger. One afternoon, as the boy sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, his mom joined him with a steaming cup of coffee. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think we should start volunteering more. Maybe help out at the community center or mentor kids who need guidance." Her suggestion caught him off guard, but in the best way possible. "That sounds amazing," he replied, smiling. "We've got so much to give." And so, they began, dedicating weekends to giving back. They organized workshops for parents on navigating emergencies, taught kids how to use technology responsibly, and even helped seniors learn basic first aid. Every act of service reminded them that the fight for fairness wasn't confined to big speeches or policy changes. It lived in the everyday moments, in the kindness shared between neighbors and strangers alike. As winter gave way to spring, the boy noticed something beautiful happening. The seeds of change they had planted months earlier were beginning to bloom. Communities came together more often, hosting events that celebrated diversity and unity. Schools implemented programs focused on empathy and inclusion. Even local businesses got involved, sponsoring campaigns to support underprivileged families. Through it all, the boy remained a constant presence, not as a leader perched on a pedestal, but as a friend, a listener, and a helper. He continued mentoring young advocates, encouraging them to find their own voices and passions. One mentee, a spirited teenager from a neighboring town, launched a campaign to provide free CPR training in underserved areas. Another started a podcast highlighting untold stories of resilience. Watching these young leaders step into their roles filled him with pride. By summer, the movement had grown beyond national borders. News outlets around the world covered the story, praising the grassroots efforts that had sparked widespread reform. Invitations poured in for international conferences and panels, asking the boy to share his experience globally. While he couldn't attend every event, he embraced the opportunity to spread the message further. At one such conference, held in a bustling city overseas, the boy delivered a keynote address that left the audience inspired. "Change starts with listening," he told them. "Listen to the people who feel unheard. Listen to the stories that challenge your perspective. And most importantly, listen to the courage inside yourself. Because when we truly hear each other, miracles happen." Back home, the boy settled into a new normal, one that balanced activism with everyday joys. He played catch with friends, baked cookies with his mom, and chased the toddler around the backyard until they collapsed in fits of giggles. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full, in ways that mattered. On the anniversary of that fateful night, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. The boy raised his glass, prompting everyone to follow suit. "To us," he said simply, "for sticking together through everything, and to everyone else out there fighting for fairness, we're not done yet." They clinked glasses, laughter filling the room. Outside, fireflies blinked in the twilight, casting a soft glow over the yard. The boy stepped onto the porch, taking a moment to breathe it all in. The scars of that night still lingered, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he, and so many others, had come. Looking toward the horizon, he felt an unshakable sense of optimism. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he knew they were building something worth fighting for. Something rooted in love, resilience, and hope. And as long as people kept listening, to each other, to their hearts, and to the world around them, they would continue to shine light into even the darkest corners. With a final glance at the stars, the boy smiled. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. Together, they all were.